Our second reading is our Old Testament reading for this morning, comes from the prophet Amos, the 7th chapter. This is a section of visions by the prophet. We drop down in the middle of one of them, and next week's reading is yet another of those visions. Amos has been sent by God. He's apparently not a professional prophet, as he will tell us in the reading, but he's been sent by God to the northern kingdom of Israel to straighten them out. Listen for what God may say to us through these words. This is what God showed me. Yahweh was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And Yahweh said, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then Yahweh said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Jeroboam was the king. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there and prophesy there. But never again prophesy in Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Then Amos answered Amaziah, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And Yahweh took me from following the flock, and Yahweh said to me, go, prophesy to my people Israel. Now therefore hear the word of Yahweh. You say, do not prophesy against Israel, and do not preach against the house of Isaac. Therefore thus says Yahweh, your wife shall become a prostitute in the city, and your sons and your daughters shall fall by the sword, and your land shall be parceled out by line. You yourself shall die in an unclean land, and Israel shall surely go into exile away from its land. And skipping over into just a bit of the reading for next week, mainly to provide context. Hear this, you that trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so we can sell grain? And Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale. We will make the ephah small and the shekel great, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. Yahweh has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. Shall not the land tremble on this account, and everyone mourn who lives in it? The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When I was a kid, my family often took camping trips to the North Carolina mountains. We usually did the Blue Ridge Parkway National Park sort of thing. We occasionally went to Tweetsie Railroad, but my parents weren't big on the real touristy spots, something to the chagrin of my brother and me. We lived at the time in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is pretty close to the mountains. And one of our local TV stations was from Asheville, North Carolina, and so we saw lots of commercials for all the mountain attractions. And not only were there the TV commercials, but the drive into the mountains was just peppered with billboards advertising every sort of tourist trap. One that fascinated me as a child was a place called Mystery Hill. The billboards spoke of it defying gravity, and they showed pictures of people standing normally, but at these odd angles to the walls. It looked magic to me, but we couldn't convince our parents to take us there. I did once go to a place called Gravity Hill. There's actually a lot of places called Gravity Hill around in the country, places where things seem to roll uphill. When I went, we drove in the car down to the bottom of the hill, stopped, put the car in neutral, took the foot off the brake, and lo and behold, the car began to back up the hill all by itself. Now, places like Gravity Hill are optical illusions created by some sort of confluence of terrain features that trick our minds as to what is actually really vertical and what is really horizontal. And apparently Mystery Hill was an even more elaborate optical illusion created by taking you in and getting you a little disoriented as they escorted you into a room where the walls and the furniture and everything else leans significantly to one side. Optical illusions under the right conditions can be so convincing that you cannot not see them, even when you know they aren't true. It seems that our eyes and our minds are not completely reliable guides as to what is really so. And so it can be helpful to have some sort of outside reference with which to test what it is we think that we see. And so when carpenters are constructing a wall, does that look straight to you? Won't cut it. Something more reliable than our eyesight is needed. And so any carpenter or builder worth his salt or her salt has got a level, probably several of them, to use to see if that wall is really straight up and down. And an older and simpler tool, which I showed the children, is a plumb line. Plumb lines still work quite well in places where it's hard to use a level. All you need is a string and a weight. Hold it, wait till it quits swinging, and you can clearly see what is straight up and down. And if I'd had one when I was at Gravity Hill, I could have easily exposed the optical illusion that made us look like we were going uphill. And if you took one to Mystery Hill, you would discover that it is the walls that are off and not gravity in that spot. In our scripture reading today, the prophet Amos seems to say that God holds up a plumb line to Israel and finds them horribly askew. Not at all what it is they were supposed to be. Now, Amos speaks at a time after Israel has split into two separate kingdoms. The smaller Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem, is in the south. Israel, the much larger, more wealthy, more successful kingdom, is in the north with its capital at Samaria. Now, these were times of relative peace and prosperity for Israel. Things were going quite well, at least for the wealthy folks. They were heady times for the rich who were building fine new homes and expanding their estates and acquiring new land. The poor were not doing so well, however, when Amos comes into Israel and begins to condemn and confront the leaders, political and religious, of Israel. Amos, by the way, is not from Israel. He's from Judah. And so when he shows up at the sanctuary, the national sanctuary in Bethel, condemning the king, well, it probably felt a little bit like a Canadian evangelical showing up in Washington and announcing that God was going to smite the President, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. Imagine how people would react if some foreign religious fanatic showed up and started yelling, "God curse America." And you probably get some notion of how a lot of people reacted to Amos. And so we can perhaps sympathize with Amaziah and understand why he confronts Amos as he does. What do you think you're doing, coming in here to the house of worship of the king, saying God's going to strike him down? What are you up to? Of course, Amaziah perhaps betrays some of his muddied loyalties when he refers to Bethel as the king's sanctuary rather than Yahweh's sanctuary. Now, I suspect if we were to do a study of some of the pastors who have served prominent D.C. congregations over the last, let's say, 100 years or so, we would probably find some who sounded a little bit like Amos, but we would probably find more who had gotten comfortable with power and prestige and who did not want to bite the hand that fed them. As a pastor, it can be a lot more tempting to be Amaziah than it is to be Amos. Of course, it all hinges on what you use to determine what's right and wrong, what sort of measures you use to decide whether or not things are as they should be or not. What sort of level or plumb line do you employ? One of the trajectories of American and Western culture that began at the Enlightenment and which seems to have accelerated in the last half century or so is a certain suspicion, even at times downright rejection, of judgments that come from outside of ourselves. Now, there's certainly a potential upside to saying, don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do. There are certainly people who would hold others back because of their prejudice or their self-interest. But taken far enough, this notion that the only real authority is that lies in myself makes gods of each individual. No outside reference, no independent plumb line exists to test and measure our decisions and our choices and our morality and the structures of our individual lives or of the societies that we construct. Now, a fundamental article of biblical faith is the idea of divine revelation. The notion of information, insights, knowledge, direction, which we never could have discovered on our own, but must be revealed to us. And without it, we build our lives and our societies in ways that are not accurate, that don't get straightened by the right plumb lines and levels, and are less than they might have been, sometimes horribly so. And I can't help thinking this morning about Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman and the justice or lack of it in a court case. Now, revelation is no God said it, I believe it, that settles it sort of thing. Revelation does not eliminate the difficult and sometimes ambiguous work of interpretation, of seeking understanding. But revelation does insist that our lives cannot be true and right if they are not straightened out and realigned with a God whose ways are not our ways, a God who calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves and to care for our enemies. And again, I wonder if George Zimmerman had lived by that plumb line, if things might have turned out so very differently that night. Now, like a lot of people, I'm a bit uncomfortable around biblical passages like ours today that take God's measures and use them to render harsh judgments. Sometimes Old Testament prophets can sound a little too much like Jerry Falwell or the Westboro Baptist folks. Of course, I'm also personally uncomfortable with being judged. It's nice to think that when I'm criticized or someone says that I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing, that as long as I feel right about it in my heart, well, by golly, I am right. But that simply is not always true, as becomes all too clear when measured against God's plumb line, when measured against Jesus' call to follow him and to live as he lived. When Jesus comes to us, he does not simply ask that we believe in him. He invites us to follow him, and in doing so, to discover new ways of living that change us and make us new. He demands our obedience, and at times he can sound downright Old Testament prophet-like. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven, who lives according to God's plumb line. But of course, if we do believe in Jesus, if we do believe that he comes from God to show us the way to true and full and abundant life, if we have faith in him and trust in him, then surely we will want to follow him and live by those measures that he shows us. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus to show us the truth and the way. Thanks be to God.